for some recap, and then I'm gonna hand it over to Mr. Knapp. Go to the next slide. So I know for some folks that are watching, you may have amazing ideas or feel as though there are some other things that you would like to be said or for us to know. Those are three very, very important emails where you can share all of your concerns, all of your ideas with myself, with Mr. Hand, who's our Director of Planning and Urban Design, and with Mr. Knapp, who is our Land Bank Manager. You can also use the chat feature in Zoom. We are capturing that, to my knowledge. We haven't had much activity there. And then email us as well. But again, that is the best way to get in contact with us and let us know. So next slide, please. If you all recall, way back when, last month, we had our meeting. We talked about quite a bit of really, really important items concerning our land bank. For our options extensions, we basically said for our land bank manager, you're good. You have the discretion of 2 years. After 2 years, bring it back to the Land Bank Board of Trustees to ascertain the situation and make a decision. For the buildable versus unbuildable, we had a discussion on balancing, removing those barriers, and I wouldn't even say adding barriers, but adding some revenue tools so that we can make the land bank as a UG division somewhat solvent and do some cost recovery for staff time. And so if there is going to be a set amount of parcels that will be set aside for development, the Land Bank Board of Trustees would have to approve and then meet a given number of years. There was other conversations on what we should do regarding the narrow home lots and residents versus non-residents and selling our land bank parcels and whether or not they should be market rate. And I'm assuming from staff, there's still some ongoing research that will have to be done for some of those items. So we are here to talk about yard extensions, as I gather, very, very fun. And Commissioner McKiernan, we stopped the party because you weren't there. And so, oh yeah, it's gonna be great. And so I'm gonna hand it off to Mr. Knapp, and we'll go ahead and continue that conversation.
All right, so today we get to talk about yard extensions. First thing we're going to do is talk about our current policy, what our current rules are. We're going to go over the number of requests we receive at the land bank for yard extensions, lot maintenance, and then the community input, and then other land bank policy research and case studies we've seen, like what other land banks are doing. And then a policy discussion at the end. So our current policy is yard extensions are only available for unbuildable lots. So then there's the yard extension eligibility requirements. What we're really talking about today is number one. Do we keep that number one unbuildable lot there or not? The other ones we're going to come back to because we have a question at the end that talks about our eligibility requirements. And basically to sum them up, they are just, you have to live in the house and the lot has to be next to you and you have to be current on your taxes. So this is a little summary of all the requests I received in 2022. Our online form was first. It came online in April of 2020. And but that form had this picture over there, had some the qualifications. And basically one of the qualification was, is it an unbuildable lot or not? I don't know how many this stopped from people going forward because the application doesn't let you proceed after this. We also updated our website, so it's pretty clear on that we don't give yard extensions away for unbuildable lots. But we've had like 240 walk-ins and 360 calls for yard extension requests. So that totals up like 711 for 2022. And we've approved 6 of those during that time span. I do have to say, if yard extensions are approved, there will be definitely an increase in the number of items that come in front of standing committee. Now we're going to shift to land bank maintenance. So right now, our crews mow each lot 5 or 6 times, depending on the rain. I think I was told to what level of mowing would not require a code violation. And that would be 15 rounds of mows. That's from April to October. And it costs $30 for each mow. So that's like $450 for each lot. The tree removal part is only for dead trees that are standing, that we pay for a contractor to come in and remove those trees. Our parks crews do not remove trees that are standing, that are dead. So with my calculations, to mow all land bank lots so they will not get a code violation is 1.9 million. Our current mowing budget is 300,000 for contractors with the Parks Department, and that's not accounting for the UG Parks and Recs mowing crew that mows land bank lots also. Our tree removal budget is 90,000. In 2022, we had 6 tree removals, and that totaled 14,000 for 2022. We don't go looking for trees to remove. That's how many requests that we received to remove some dead trees. So,
and if I may just pause here really quick. So this is another great example. Gunnar Hand, Director of Planning and Design. This is another great example where it's what's the difference between policy, process, and procedure and strategy, right? So if we do, I think the policy is to maintain the lots that we have, and we don't do a good job at that, right? Because there's just so many of them. So if we wanted to get to the point where we mowed them to quote unquote code, we're talking about a significant budget increase, because what we're budgeted right now to do the mowing is woefully inefficient to get them to code. And that's a function of the number of lots more than anything else, right? I would also argue that this is an impetus to avoid that $1.9 million by getting yard extensions to private property owners, that we don't have to maintain these properties as fast as possible. We had around 700 inquiries last year and only processed 6 yard extensions. And that is people who, most of them didn't even make it to the application process once they saw the standards and were just like, well, screw that, right? So keep going, Judd, but I just wanted to insert real quick right there. This is not a policy recommendation. This influences our discussion a little bit later on.
All right, so now let's go into some of our community feedback that we received from our many listening sessions that we had. So these are pros and cons considering yard extensions. The comments we received, there are pros: there's spaces for use, gardens, been mowing for years, and reduced maintenance costs if we allow yard extension. Now the cons aren't necessarily, they're cons for yard extensions. So these are also comments that we received from the community. They are looking for affordable housing. They're looking to increase the tax base, increase density, and fewer or no vacant lots. They also said they want the land bank to get rid of itself too. That was another one. But basically those cons are because we have research that say yard extensions stay vacant. Like, people do not build on them. Once they get them, vacant lots decrease property values. That was all part of those presentations during our feedback sessions. And the little picture on the side there is a little activity we had in our last listening session where 84% of the people agreed that yard extensions should be allowed, and only one person disagreed with that. So as we looking at land bank, we look what other land banks are doing, what innovative approaches they're working on, and how they deal with yard extensions. Most land banks call them side lots, but they're basically the same thing as yard extensions. In Detroit, it has to be touching your property line. It has to be your primary residence, and you have to be current on property taxes. They actually have 2 tiers. This first tier is I think it's 180 days where the property is just available to the person at the primary residence. Then it goes to neighborhood lot after that, where anyone within 500 feet can get that lot. And they can purchase 2 lots per year. They do have something interesting. They do have land review areas where we can put holds on property. That's where they use public works projects, infrastructure, housing projects that are coming. So they still do put properties, they still do remove yard extensions from all lots. And they do have the priority of applications. The first priority is if you're living in the property. And then the second one is if you're the first to submit an application. In Kansas City, Missouri basically does the same thing as we do, but they have no, they do not. They, if you take the unbuildable out, they pretty much match our eligibility criteria. But they have less than 6,000 square feet, so they put a size requirements on their yard extensions. They do have some other stipulations, like you must join the parcels together, you must have a beneficiary on the deed, and multiple adjacent property owners with the same lot that want the same lot. They have to do a bidding process where the highest bidder gets it. St. Louis, they have non-buildable lots for parcels less than 4,000 square feet, because that's the minimum for new construction in the city of St. Louis. This program pretty much matches what we currently do with buildable and non-buildable lots. This is a brand new policy that just came out in March. So it's basically a copy of what we do now. And they also do where the unbuildable lots are pre-approved for sale from the board of commissioners. So that means that somebody could come in and wants that lot, and the land bank manager could deed that property without coming in front of the board. That's another. Little Rock, Arkansas, basically the same eligibility requirements again. But they have like 75% of the common boundary line on the side. So basically 75% has to be touching your property to get that yard extension. Now we're going to go into kind of like how we price lots. This is our current policy on pricing lots. We price lots on the greater of the two options there. We sell property for the appraised value. And if it's unbuildable, we can reduce that by half. And we also do the value of property's frontage by times 10. I got a little example. So if it's 25-foot frontage times $10, that's $250 for that lot. That rule, I've never used that rule yet, because our properties are, you know, like in the 500 to 1,000 range, most of them. So that rule hasn't been used. So I got some maps of what land bank properties are actually valued at. So this first map is $0 to $1,000, and there's 3,470 of them. Next is from 1,000 to 5,000. There's 665 of those. 5,000 to 10,000, 157. 10,000 to 20, there's 201. 20,000 to 50,000, there's 94. And there's 13 of them over 50,000. And now some of those are like BPU parcels that are still in there that we need to get rid of. But so here's a little example of a actual yard extension that was approved. This is at 3208 North 42nd Street. The house to the north needed a new septic system, and so they requested this unbuildable lot to build that septic system. But the appraised value of that lot was $15,000. I can reduce that by half, so it's $7,500. The applicant eventually paid for this lot because he was selling the house unexpectedly, but that's just an example of our pricing. Here's a little comparison of our yard extensions. We sell them for the appraised value. Other cities that we've looked at sell Detroit for 100. KCMO is 20% of the assessed value, or $75, which is greater. St. Louis is 85, and Little Rock, Arkansas is 500. So what you're seeing here is we sell our properties for a lot more than what other land banks sell them for. Just in a comparison, for our buildable lots, we sell them for $1. And that brings us to our policy discussions.
All right, Gunnar Hand, Director of Planning and Design. So again, in the spirit of, we've had subsequent meetings that have built policy conversations on one another. Very similarly, this continues from the previous conversation about buildable, unbuildable, but it also sort of succinctly goes through all these questions to get at it. So if you allow us to kind of go through this exercise with you all, we'll then open it up to any questions, comments, or other things. But this is basically, as we look at it as staff, some of the direction we need from you to put together a draft. So the first question is pretty straightforward. We currently allow yard extensions. Should we continue to allow yard extensions in the unified government? looking for a qualified yes or no. The next questions are all yes, but, or yes, ands. So we will go over the yes, ands.
Awesome. So just kind of this particular will be for the discussion of yes or no. Commissioner Ramirez, yes, I'm a yes. Commissioner McKiernan, do you have a question or is that what is that? A hand raise?
That is a hand raise, but it's a yes. But I think, and I know, Gunnar, you're going to get into this, but there's a lot of interesting nuances in some of the different regulations and qualifications that some of the other cities had. But since I just saw those for the first time 30 seconds ago, I'd like some time to consider some of those nuances. But allow yard extensions? Yes, 100% yes from me.
Okay. Other members? Commissioner Markley. Commissioner Markley is a yes. Commissioner Bynum is also yes. So yes, to continue offering yard extensions. Yes, that is recommendation.
Awesome. Thank you. If we could go to slide 22, Tiffany. So I want to go back to what our current standards are. And the current standards that we have, I think generally speaking, there's really nothing wrong with them, except for two things. One, when we talked about buildable and buildable last month, we agreed to move forward with developable and undevelopable, right? So developable parcels will redefine all the things we want to see come out of land bank properties, be they yard extensions, gardens, or development, right? That was one of the things we talked about. In doing that, we still keep what we're now going to try to think about as undevelopable parcels. And these parcels are weird shapes. They're in gullies. They, this, that, and the other. And then we agreed that we would create a system and a mechanism to then disperse of those in some way, shape, or form, give them to parks, combine them with other parcels, keep them for right of way. We talked about all that stuff last week. So if we cut out number one, what is left are, I would say, relatively okay, probably could build on more requirements, but only for properties that are abutting or your property. So our policy only allows yard extensions when you're adjacent to that yard. There had been previous conversations about yard extensions are something else, but I guess what staff would say is, are the remainder of these okay? And do we want to do anything in yard extensions more than an abutting property? So that next question, abutting as we interpret it is a property that shares a property line. So if you're down the block, that's not a yard extension, that's just a land bank. And you apply for it as a land bank lot, which is fine.
Just a question.
Sure.
Thinking to the past, when a church wants a lot diagonal for parking, what do we consider that?
So that's a great question. That is the question.
Okay.
And this actually came up in the Woodside project when we were defining abutting versus adjacent. So I think sticking and being consistent with that, abutting is something that shares a property line. If you're across a right of way, be it an alleyway or a street, that's adjacent, or that's within a block of that property. But again, I think to make all of this much simpler for everybody, I would say there's really no different than that church applying for a yard extension if it was the property adjacent to them versus applying for the one kitty corner from them as a regular land bank lot. It's still the same process. You still go through the land bank. You just check land bank instead of yard extension.
And it's not a land bank option.
We're going to get to that.
Okay. That really was my question. Is it land bank, like a straight out land bank, or is it a land bank option?
Oh, I see what you're saying. I think the way we would handle this, I'm going to look at legal for that one.
Wendy Green, Legal Department. Currently, the way the policy would read, it would be an option agreement to see if they were going to build on the lot.
And by build, do we mean lay asphalt for parking?
I don't think we define build, to tell you the truth. It's make an improvement.
Okay.
So build a structure,
Yeah.
put down asphalt for parking, because that actually has value too, and it is considered an improvement in appraisal terms.
Okay.
So I don't know that we distinguish between those two different things.
It would also require a permit. So I think that would potentially qualify as a building permit. But again, I think that gets to the core of this. If we stop thinking about yard extensions as something that we need to build on, which is what our current policy is, versus a yard extension, which is it's an extension of your yard. And therefore, I think the avenue we're advocating for, if you will, because it makes it a lot simpler, is we remove the requirement. Therefore, we would remove, I think, the option agreement, and it would just be, you get the property.
Commissioner McKiernan, do you have something?
Just one thing, in terms of these 6 criteria, I am perfectly fine with letting go of number 1, leaving the remaining 5. But after consideration, I do think that it's interesting. Detroit has some sort of a maximum linear footage or maximum square footage. We might want to consider something like that in terms of the size of the adjacent parcel to be acquired. I mean, certainly, and Commissioner Davis, you sat in on this. We had an applicant a couple of meetings ago who requested 2 25-foot frontage vacant lots next door to each other, and then was going to combine them into one lot and build one house on them with a big yard. That's effectively a narrow house and a yard extension. And he was able to do it that way, but we wouldn't let somebody with the lot next door that they're already cutting acquire it to continue to maintain it. So I'm fully in favor of this, but I do think some sort of maximum size acquisition would be an interesting thing to consider.
Yes.
This is Wendy with legal. The only reason I would caution against size restrictions is because those, I would say 99% of the time, are going to require a survey. And so who do we make bear the cost of the survey? Is it the person that wants the lot, or is it the land bank? Because surveys are usually around $3,000 or so. So that would be my only caution, is if we're going to use the side restriction, we need to keep that in mind as well.
For the
So
public.
if you,
Oh, I was going to ask you real quick, Commissioner McKiernan, you define survey and kind of how.
So our mapping department will not create legal descriptions. So if we are going to take an existing parcel that has a legal description already assigned to it, and we're going to carve off part of it to give to somebody applying, if we develop a size restriction, like the other land bank has that Commissioner McKiernan was talking about.
Yep.
We would have to have that surveyed to figure out what the new legal description for that portion is, so that we can effectively transfer it to whoever is applying for it. And to do that, we would have to have a survey to come up with the new legal description, because like I said, our mapping department will not create new legal descriptions. They're not in the business of surveying land.
Gotcha. Commissioner McKiernan.
in that case, what I would say is I'm fine with that. Not surveying, just allotting the parcel as is currently legally defined. And basically it's up to the applicant purchaser then to just make sure that whatever they obtain, they maintain. And I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I think to that comment, essentially, again, the requirements, you can only get 1 yard extension. So you can't just keep getting yard extensions to grow your property. That's already in the policy, right? But so I think there's a little bit of a safety net built into that. But I think if someone applies, they come to the land bank and they say, I want to build something, that's one path forward, get a land bank lot. They want a yard extension, that's a different pathway forward. We're not going to get there. Well, we might get there today, but gardens, that is potentially, once we have that conversation, a third pathway forward that are different ways of dispersing of land bank properties, where right now we kind of have like a one-fits-all system that doesn't really work and is kind of messy because it crosses a lot of lines. Yard extensions, I think, probably being the best example. And so I think the next question that led up to this.
Before we do
go
that,
ahead, sorry.
Commissioner Ramirez or Commissioner Bynum, y'all have any questions or anything?
I have a question and a comment. So because I remember from our last conversation of you were talking about developable and undevelopable.
Mhm.
So with number 1, would we change that instead of unbuildable, it'd be undevelopable, or just taking that requirement off altogether?
I think in the policy documents, Gunnar Hand, Director of Planning and Design, I think in the policy document itself, what you'll see is developable and undevelopable more clearly defined in a different section, and this will just be removed.
Okay. And then I say I would agree with most of the colleagues and commissioners. I'm fine with the majority of all of the other requirements. I think if, as you said, Gunnar, if it's just a yard extension, the property should be abutting your property line.
Okay.
If that for a yard extension, in my opinion. Because we don't want to, we have a homeowner here who wants a yard extension down the street. That's not a yard extension. It's not connected to your property. So.
And I think to Judd's earlier examples, the only, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Knapp, but the only other city that it does more than abutting is Detroit, which allows you to do sort of behind the alley of you. And I would still argue, and again, I'm looking for your direction, whether we stick with abutting or if it's something else on a block adjacent to, again, I would argue that anything that's not abutting is just a land bank request. Be it for a garden, be it for whatever, right? And so just another confirmation before we move forward. Are we cool with how as staff currently thinks of it as abutting, or do you want to open up another conversation about adjacencies or per block? Sorry. I love these meetings. I don't know what you guys are talking about. Okay, so then to double back, and I apologize, it's not on the screen, but it's an important one. I want to make sure we also get this clear direction. With this kind of evolved thinking about yard extensions, can we eliminate the policy that requires them to get a building permit and build something on a yard extension? Yeah. And I just want to very quickly go back to the original start of the presentation where we show you all the land bank lots and the number of options we did last year and how we're not moving the needle. Again, I think with the right amount of restrictions managed the right way, we can dispense of a lot more land bank parcels for people. Those lots that are underneath those parcels, so they're probably going to take those lots and the policy will say something like you have to join them together, right? You can't just keep the two lots. We want you to put them together. It's a bigger looking lot, but it's still one parcel. That's one taxable entity. That is not the underlying lots that are platted. Those are still there, which means in the future, if this, let's say now vacant block becomes developed for whatever reason, that property owner has technically two lots on one parcel. They can still develop that lot in the future. So it's not like that development is gone away. It's in some private owner's hand to maintain and develop it at their leisure, convenience, benefit in the future. So this is another example of a potential wealth building opportunity for folks, that they can keep it and tax it as more area, but those lots underneath, unless they replat it for some reason, which costs thousands of dollars and they don't need to do for any real reason, they could always come back and build a house on that. And that's bonus, I would say, for everybody.
Agreed. I think that's the other part of this is if we're not moving the needle to get the rooftops, then let's return, let's give some of these properties back to the residents, predominantly within the Northeast, who will now have ample opportunity to build wealth for themselves and for their families, which I think is great. I was going to ask a question, but I forgot it. Yeah, let's move on to the next question on that slide. I think it was 22.
All right, now we need to get into the pricing of this. So we've had this conversation a couple of times in the past, right? So the current policy, if you look at just how we price things, clearly prioritizes building over just land, right? If you saw in all the examples we've looked for, we are the only ones that charge market rate for yard extensions and give a discount $1 for buildable lots. Everybody else does the inverse. That's not good or bad. I think that's just an observation. So I don't know if staff necessarily has a recommendation here, other than I think we would prefer to understand the direction for you of, given the options that we have, which is market rate like we currently do it, some type of flat rate, which is what most cities do for yard extensions, or maybe addressing Commissioner Kiernan's concern, maybe the pricing of that yard extension is based on the size of that yard extension, and that's how we address potentially very large parcels abutting a property. I don't know if that's an imperfect solution, but again, I think that might also address that concern. So I think we just want to get clear direction on which way you want us to go, and then we'll come up with a recommendation and we can talk through that recommendation one way or the other. I don't think we need to pick a dollar amount today or a rate at which we do it market rate or anything like that. But I think I need direction, market rate, flat rate, or some sort of by size value, by size, by frontage, by something like that.
Commissioner McKiernan, you have some thoughts?
I would be in favor of the third option that you just mentioned, that we have some multiplier against the total area of the parcel to be acquired, but that multiplier be very, 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 very reasonable, small, so that there is something that the acquiring party has to invest in the proposition. But in light of what they're about to do, which is take maintenance responsibility away from us, a very reasonable multiplier against the total square footage is what I would favor. By reasonable, I mean small.
Commissioner Ramirez.
Thank you, Commissioner Davis. I'm going to go with Commissioner McKiernan on this. We always say he's our data and graph guy. And so I trust in what he says and what he believes, but I do think it's by size. I would agree with that.
Anybody else?
Other commissioners, I would be fine with, I mean, yes, by size, $10, $20, whatever, per 10 feet, or $1 per feet, $2 per feet, whatever, or square footage. I
think what I would say is any of the options other than market rate will be significantly less than market rate.
Yeah, and again, I think we would all know that we can look at it multiple ways. Are we losing money here? Are we leaving money on the table? Hypothetically, I mean, there's a lot of things hypothetically that we could be doing, but we know for sure that 700 number of applicants and 6, now we're going to get to a disposal rate of maybe 20, 30, 40%. And quite frankly, it's a double net positive because we're not paying to maintain, and we get hopefully a few $1,000s per year to dispose of these properties. So, yeah.
Cool. That's all the direction we need for yard extensions to come up with the draft for you all. Is there any other questions, comments, other thoughts that you wanted to bring up specific to yard extensions? Otherwise, we are ready to move into gardens, and we can do that right now.
Exciting. This would apply to not just residential, but to commercial. Would it apply to business owners, or would they have to go through the regular land bank process? Has that been considered? Have we thought through? Churches?
Well, we really don't have that many commercial ones out there, but the rules state it has to be your primary residence.
Okay.
You have to live there. But if we want to,
I think that the policy should address commercial in addition to residential. I think every conversation we just had about this was only focused on residential. So if you want, we can either come back with commercial, or, to be honest with you, based on the limited number of parcels, I would recommend that we just write that down and come up with a recommendation to address it. I think it'll be different unless you have other direction regarding that. I don't think it should be treated the same.
Okay.
That's
Yeah.
what my gut tells me, at least. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can save it for another conversation and let staff do some more research and some more consideration on it. But I do think we would need to consider non-residential property owners, right? Or non-primary resident property owners who own properties that are next to a land bank property, what are we going to do with that? I do believe it should be treated different, but how differently, and can we do that, right, according to state law? Other thoughts on yard extensions? Okay, well, thank
Gardens.
you so much, staff. We can move on to gardens.
I didn't think we'd make it this far, but
Getting better.
Gotcha. All right. So for gardens, we're going to go through the current policy, what our policy is today, our community input, and what other land banks are doing, and a policy discussion. So our current policy is you must be affiliated with a larger gardening group. There was an individual garden rule in our policy, but it was a lease program, and we discontinued that in 2020. That's when I first came on board that we stopped doing that because the lease program was it's very hard to deal with and very hard to administer. But we do have the community gardens part, and was for non-for-profit areas like organizations like Cultivate KC and it's like. So there's we identified 3 types of gardens. We try to put these in little buckets. Victory gardens are small, they're private. They're not next to your house because that would be a yard extension. These are kind of like they're on your same block. They're in the neighborhood type of thing. Then you have community gardens that are like garden clubs or a collective of neighbors come together and they want to garden in one spot and come together. And then urban farms are like businesses, and that's like greenhouses. That's like some gardening infrastructure there. And I know there's some zoning issues with that, so that might be its own little discussion later. But those are kind of the types of gardens we have. So I did a little bit of research on what other land banks do, and they all lease them that I've found so far. The city of Columbus, they hold vacant parcels for development, but the lots can be leased during the time that lot is waiting to be developed. They have their eligibility is it has to be vacant, a residential lot, so not a commercial lot. And then they have a 1-year lease that's $50 that can be renewed every year for $10. And I mean, collecting money as a staff it's painful getting people to pay for that, and then canceling people when they don't is difficult. Water is another thing. Is that applicants are responsible for the connection to the water because these are vacant lots. They don't have a water connection. Structures, they must be approved by the land banks, and that's like hoop houses or chicken coops or things like that. The city of Columbus actually provides like a water containment system. So they provide like a 550-gallon cistern that sits on the lot, and they fill it up once a year. They have a voucher for property improvements with Lowe's is partnered with them to give them money to start their garden, and then they get soil delivered too. So these are like extreme examples of what people do, but Kansas City, Missouri, they lease their gardens for 2 to 5 years, and during that lease, we can't sell it. I believe our current policy is now with the lease that we can sell it, but we will give you enough time to get your produce off of the garden. So we're just not going to let you work on it and then sell it in July, and you don't get any of your fruits of your labor. So then they allow like minor building on lots, like just water and fences. So there's like really no greenhouses going on in KCMO. Lansing, Michigan, they actually have a garden coordinator in their land bank program. They have 100 gardens and it totals 4 acres. They lease also, and the applicant must maintain, and they also provide soil test, tilling, compost, and plant starts even. So here's some of our community feedback that 74% believe that the land bank should be used for gardens. The second from the last one is they require a business plan. Suggestion was to require a business plan for the approval process and provide a 2-year trial period. So land bank gardens in general, the pros to them, we don't have to maintain the lot. Vacant lots are actually being used. From our research, when vacant lots look vacant, it increases crime. So now these lots look like they're being used, and these lots are used to grow food in a food desert. The cons are it could become an eyesore. People view gardens that could be like not maintained or might look like a code violation. The tax revenue versus a new home is very low, and the water connection might be an issue because they're vacant lots. This is kind of an example of the first picture is between two houses. So first of all, this would be a yard extension for any one of those two neighbors. And then, but can somebody else come in and garden in between two neighbors? Or as the second picture is, there's like a lot and then there's vacant lot and there's like a whole string of them. Is that lots available for a garden? Like how far away from that house would we allow a garden to go in?
Okay, so same thing. Gunnar Hand, Director of Planning and Design. For the policy discussion here, we have a couple of succinct questions we want to ask, and it starts not too dissimilar from yard extension. Currently, the land bank policy allows gardens, but only very specifically as it relates to businesses or gardens associated with a neighborhood group. And so typically those turns into, or I think without saying it, it infers community gardens, right? We've gotten a lot of feedback for a lot of years, quite frankly, even before this land bank policy update and the public engagement process we did late last year, about expanding more for urban farming in the UG. I think, as Mr. Knapp noted, there's a lot of zoning changes that need to happen to make these things happen. There's potentially zoning categories that need to be created. I'm saying all this to say that I don't think we should allow an ideal policy here to be shaped by the lack of zoning flexibility elsewhere. I think if this commission subcommittee wants to move forward with expanding the rights of gardening on land bank for land gardening as a use for land bank properties, it just becomes a greater impetus for us to make those changes sooner and faster. So I just want to qualify that statement. Like, I'm happy to talk about all the intricacies of zoning and accessory structures and all the problems we have and stuff like that, but I don't want that to interfere with what we want the policy to be. We can work towards that elsewhere if need be. So with that, let me just qualify. Do we want to continue with gardens for land bank properties? Another qualified yes or no.
Commissioner Markley.
Thanks, Commissioner Davis. I definitely think we want to continue with it. I will say, as you're looking at how to sort of format that policy, my concern is always, even with a community group run garden, when the group of people who have primarily run the garden are gone for whatever reason, we have to have a way to take that land back. And a lot of times those gardens, not all the time, but a lot of times those gardens are run by older folks. And at some point they just get where they can't handle them anymore. And there may or may not be another group that steps up to take care of them. So that's always my concern with gardens. But I think we should definitely continue doing it in some format. I'd be interested in looking through how that policy works out.
Thank you. Commissioner Ramirez.
I agree with what Commissioner Markley said. I think we should continue them. And in just my opinion, as one member of this subcommittee, is I would like to see some form of expansion. As I do my own policy research of things, I've been surprised to see even the last year, how big urban farming has become throughout the country, and other jurisdictions and other cities are doing, not just with their land banks, but just in general of urban farming. And so I understand, I think it'd be good if this could help us jumpstart that. And, that, as you were saying, don't let this be to push us back or not want to do it. But I think it'd be good for us to look into some type of expansion. Now, whatever that is, and we'll have to have that conversation, but I do agree we should keep gardens as as an option.
If I could jump in, just in response to that, Commissioner. A lot of the feedback that we got, Alyssa Marcy, Long Range Planner, is that we have a lot of interest in organizations or individuals that would like to establish urban farms, right? So that they can grow and then sell. And that addresses a lot of different needs in our community, right? Because that also addresses our food systems and, you know, our food deserts. I will also say there are ancillary benefits to having gardens on land bank lots. And, you know, considering that many of our former land bank lots were once homes and that their basements are buried underground, most of our land bank lots are brownfields. I'm coordinating that now for the UG as well. So I think it's also important to consider, you know, what kind of remediation would happen faster if you allowed that kind of use.
Just for those watching, can you explain what brownfields are, just to make sure?
Yeah, sure. So brownfields are essentially sites that were contaminated by previous development or uses. Common contamination that we see is from, for example, older homes, maybe that had lead pipes or asbestos, especially since these basements of homes were buried. That means that lead and asbestos goes into the ground. A current example of that is the Northeast Grocers project. That is exactly what they're dealing with in the building that's there. Other examples are laundromats or nearby gas stations that had leaks that were underground that get into the soil. So anytime you have a property that has contamination, it needs to be remediated in order to use it.
Thank you. I'm absolutely yes for gardens. I make the distinction between a garden and a urban farmer or a farm, right? So that's the other kind of interesting nuance here, right? The garden, not to say that it couldn't be for a small business, right, venture, but most of the time you're seeing it as a community amenity, right? Beautification, right? Things of that sort, which is great, right? As a current gardener myself. That's different than an urban farmer where there's potential tax revenue and job creation. And that is where I would behoove this subcommittee to think about, is not just, right, just some land where we're seeing fruits and vegetables grow, but can we look at this as another pathway of entrepreneurship for our residents, primarily within the Northeast? The other thing we have to keep in mind is we have a lot of folks moving here from various different places all throughout our world, and they have different farming techniques that they take with them that can be used here, right, in Wyandotte County. I would love for us as a unified government to see that as a talent that can be cultivated and nurtured, as opposed to something that is a nuance because in off season it looks like blight, right? And we can work on what the aesthetics of an off season urban farm looks like, right, and the value that it has to the community. But I see it with those two particular distinctions. I am a yes, but I just wanted to put that out there, that there is real potential for us to be of better support to urban farmers here in Wyandotte County, as Alyssa was alluding to. So yeah, next question.
Yeah, so I think with that direction, again, if you remember recalling that one of the first slides of this section of the presentation, we kind of separated between victory gardens, community gardens, and urban farms. I think there's a lot of nuances in those three general categories. There might be more categories even when we dive into it a little bit. So I think with that direction, we'll go back and ferret out that recommendation and see and make sure we work directly with some of the gardening groups who have provided input through this process, specifically because they have very, I think their knowledge is clearly much greater.
Yeah, can I add one more thing, just so the subcommittee is aware of how serious this is? The USDA's currently trying to repair some of the systemic racism within the department in which they have not allowed particularly Black farmers, but other farmers of marginalized identities from getting access to dollars. And they're looking at communities like ours and they're saying, let's make an investment. We do have one particular organization that has received a sizable contribution from the USDA for the purpose of farming, and I'm talking 6-figure, right? And so that is just an example of, we have all of this vacant land. We have these organizations that are ready to go. We have folks that have recently migrated here that would like to be integrated into our economy. And we have a federal government department, one of many, the EPA included as well as the US Department of Agriculture, that is looking to make an investment. I think we can really set the table, and this could be a part of the reformation of our community. So.
Excellent. All right. So the next question is, currently in the policy, we only allow gardens if we lease the project. And I think generally speaking, we understand why that is. That is essentially our clawback after potentially multiple years if things fall apart, as Commissioner Markley sort of mentioned earlier on. I think I'll just go ahead and straight out. Leases are a nightmare to manage for staff, especially when it's one land bank manager and that's it. And an executive assistant now with Ms. Portley in the economic development department. It's just very hard to manage. It requires more staff than we have. I would look to the global argument that I keep going back to, which is we have a lot of land bank parcels. I think on the back end, if we want to think about clawbacks, I think Wendy has a recommendation to consider on that. But again, I think for us, the codes aren't there currently. The property codes are there currently, but the zoning codes and all the other standards and potentially, again, new zoning categories for smaller type, not less than 5-acre AG properties, right? I think are where the direction we're heading. I think that is the appropriate place to talk about the standards by which these farms look and feel, not in our land bank policy. I want to make sure that the land bank policy stays focused on how and why we want to dispense that property for gardens, not the back end, how we manage it. Does that make sense? I don't think the enforcement of these things here, but the one thing that overlaps in those two realms is how we claw it back, because I think that's the hard part here.
Wendy Green with legal, if I could weigh in on this one. So again, the lease would be a good way to claw back, but again, it's a logistical nightmare to manage. A deed restriction, again, it's also, if we want to claw it back, that's going to require us to file an action in court and actually sue whoever we had deeded it to, then for them to give us the property back, in essence. If they're not willing to just deed it back to us, then that would be our only remedy with it. If we had deeded it to them with restrictions, we would still have to take them to court to get that property back. It wouldn't be an automatic thing. It would have to be a court order for the court to say, yes, you didn't do what you were supposed to do, and therefore the property reverts back to the land bank. So the only other way we could do, I was thinking that we could do a clawback, is why don't we maybe look at how we do our option agreements? You know, maybe we give them an option of 1 year or 2 year and see if they're actually serious about it. And if they are, then after that period, then we simply deed it to them and we make sure that they've got something in place for its succession, if that makes sense. Like maybe we deed it to them and then we help them even do a transfer on death deed or something to that effect. Again, though, those are revocable during their lifetime, so they could change it. So is it perfect? No, but it might be a way to have a clawback on a garden without having to manage a lease and without having to take someone back to court to get the property back if they don't do what they're supposed to do.
It's probably not what you guys want to hear, but if things fall apart with an urban farm, a community garden, or a victory garden, and those parcels still exist, those underlying lots still exist to be developed sometime in the future. They don't go away. We're just talking about changes in ownership. I think staff would argue that we let it fall back into the land bank if it falls back. If it doesn't, then it's a private piece of property that is subject to all codes and ordinances and must be maintained as per codes and ordinances. And if they don't pay their taxes, it ends up in the land bank, and that's why we have a land bank. Again, it's an imperfect answer, but
Again, this is Wendy with legal, and just to, historically speaking, I would say that that's how we ended up with a lot of the vacant lots in the land bank. Maybe somebody was using them and then just decided it wasn't worth it anymore, or they had the lot, family didn't realize they had the lot, and so it just went by the wayside when they died. Obviously at some point or other, somebody owned all these vacant lots that were in the land bank, and it just kind of, whatever they were doing, their interest is gone. They never developed it like they thought they would. So that would be another reason is, just let them have the ownership. And then if that exact same thing happens again, then we just take it back through our normal tax sale process like we do. But like we got all of these to begin with. But I will tell you, just in the last couple of years, when we switched to an online auctioneer for these, we sell a lot more vacant lots now than we ever used to through these tax sales.
Yeah, Commissioner Bynum.
I stated last month a lot of my thoughts on this item. Couple of slides before this one is something about what Kansas City, Missouri does. Maybe, is there one before that? I like what the cities are doing to promote the gardening. I like that a lot, but I think it's forward to KCMO. I don't know.
City of Columbus.
There.
Kansas City, Missouri.
During the lease, the property can't be sold. I think that's what got my attention. Meaning the city won't sell it.
from underneath you.
And that was, I think, the opposite of why we were leasing our lots here instead of selling them, because our thought process was, but when the better deal comes, we're yanking that away from you, which was why I bristled so much about it. And still do. And it makes me say, sell the lot. I don't understand the lease concept, to be honest. Go ahead.
Well, let's ask Jed, how many leases do we have for gardens right now?
None. We stopped leases in 2020.
Because I know because it's a pain in the fanny, and I don't understand the concept of doing it that way at all. And I made that clear last month. So I would not be amenable at all to leasing a lot for gardening. I'm all about gardening. I don't want you guys to think that I'm some big major gardener. Because I'm not.
You're not a green thumb, Commissioner?
No, but I have a spouse who is,
There you go.
and I'm what I am is intensely interested in particularly providing access to fresh food in places where it doesn't exist and where I don't think we've been helpful in allowing it to exist. So what you say about the urban farming piece of it is very exciting, especially as you say, my golly, can local, state and federal actually come together strategically to make something better? That would be amazing. When we talk, I don't know why we need a clawback either. Sell the lot. This is the point I was making last month. Sell the lot or deed the lot or whatever you want to call it. We have WCAC at 20th and Central with an amazing orchard. that they built because they took a park off of our hands that we weren't taking care of. And it's truly amazing. And it's feeding the community, and it probably has value now. And if they die, which they will, because we're all going to, let the organization deed the lot, sell the lot, whatever. The same way I have the right to sell my house. And the other thing I'm wondering about is less than 2 blocks from here, we have an amazing organization doing amazing things. And I might be wrong, but I think the lot they acquired behind their building was a land bank lot. And it is now an amazing garden. And I don't think they went it through any kind of lease or garden hoopla. They got a lot and they planted a garden. And I just don't understand what's, why are we having all this conversation about a garden? I just don't get it.
I think, if I don't know if we have any devil's advocates here. If we do have some. Okay, Commissioner Markley.
I don't know that I'm a devil's advocate. No, I mean, it makes sense to some extent. We just, I think, have to be prepared for the reality that the term on those lots may be shorter than we would like, and that we are maybe dealing with them again. And if we're dealing with them by taking them back into the land bank through the process, I guess my only question is whether that's more staff time or less staff time than if we leased them. Because I guess I was thinking by leasing them, we were making it easier for them to come back to the land bank if that happened. But maybe that's not the case. Maybe it's just as easy to let it go through the tax sale process and go back to the land bank. So I can be convinced.
And I think there's sort of two things that I think we're discussing here that I will make sure we do them not at the same time. And so there's this idea of whether it needs an option agreement or some clawback at all. So do we look at gardens like we look at yard extensions? Or do we look at gardens like we look as developable parcels? And I don't know what the answer is there, but those are two different questions that I want to make sure that we're thinking through. The other thing is I think we also need to maybe talk about or get direction from you all on, instead of limiting, there's some limiting factor I think that we need to discuss here. Otherwise, we don't want to encourage speculation by someone coming in and saying, I'm going to build a garden on this thing. Like yard extensions, is there a limit to the number that we give to an organization or geographic criteria? I think some direction on there, I think, is another key vein of this conversation that we should think about. Otherwise, there's a potentiality for someone to come in, say, I'm going to build a garden, and then build a house. I mean, I guess we wouldn't care, right? If they switched it up on us. If the garden fails, again, it goes back in the land bank. But again, I think we don't want someone circumventing the rules either. So I think there is a what's the thing where you keep within the bumper cars? There's some guide rail there, I think, that we need to think through around gardens. And I think if you have any direction on that specifically, we'll take that right now. But I think that's something we could also think about as staff and come up with as a recommendation later on.
This is Wendy with legal again. I was just going to weigh in what Commissioner Markley said, and the cost differential, if we take it back because they don't do what they're supposed to and they quit paying their taxes, it's different staff. We have an entire department that's all they do is get properties ready for a tax sale and prepare stuff for tax sales. It's wonderful. It's like I have my own office that helps me with tax sales. It's great. So it's completely different staff rather than like the land bank trying to do it.
Yeah.
We have other. Yeah, I mean, I would throw, right, and I'm like, it's not just a garden, right? So we're really, in my eyes, to see it as like gardening, farming, right, and then orchards as well. I don't think as far as a benefit, I don't think we've also talked about the climate benefit of this, right? There's real interest in tree planting. There's real interest in basically creating spaces that would absorb CO2 out of the air, and there's real interest in purchasing that. That is very, very forward thinking, but I do think we need to start thinking, how do we, right, turn these vacant parcels into not just homes and businesses, but other mechanisms that could also bring in revenue for the UG and create wealth for our citizens. As far as the options go, I mean, I'm to stop the spot, not stop, but to sniff out the speculation. I mean, if you can fake that you're a gardener for 2 years, I mean, have the parcel, because it's not easy, right? But I would be okay with a option of 1 or 2 years in which we could see some sort of effort as the Land Bank Board of Trustees to say, yes, we have done what we've said we wanted to do. And then that option of kind of permanent award after.
Okay.
I would be good with that.
I think if that's the direction you want to go, I think staff could make that work. I think you got to remember, just because it's a garden doesn't mean it's not a significant investment either, right? So, and sometimes it takes more than just one growing season to get a garden established. So 1 year might not be fair enough. So it might be different. So I guess it's parity with how we deal with other stuff, right? Because it's all option agreements, but there's flexibility in what I'm hearing potentially for gardens, because it's just a different animal. It should take you a year to get your permits to build the thing. It should take you no more than 2 years to establish a garden and prove to us that you can do this.
I'm okay with, listen, like, we see some holes, right? We see some mulch. We see, different things in the ground, like just something that shows effort and that shows maintenance. I mean, we're not gardeners, but something that would hold, right, that applicant accountable to say, here are the pictures, here's what we've done, kind of report back to the, to the standing committee for neighborhood and community development on what you've done. It doesn't even have to be as extensive as you're saying, Mr. Hand.
Sure. Awesome.
I don't know, for subcommittee, is that good? Okay, cool.
All right, the next thing we want to talk through is the ownership. Again, the current policy really focuses in on you have to be some sort of partnering with some nonprofit organization. All right, so if we think about gardens now in these 3 different categories, Victory Garden, Community Garden, Urban Farms, Orchards, whatever, maybe more, lots of nuances in between those. If we go back to the yard extension conversation, if some property owner gets a yard extension, but still wants to do a garden down the street and apply for a land bank lot, why would they have to partner with a nonprofit to do their own Victory Garden, right? Or conversely, if we only give to nonprofits, while most of these people that we're getting inquiries about are coming out of New Roots program, which is a nonprofit, they want to buy their own property and start their own businesses. So they might be either a private property owner or an LLC that we cannot then have be a part of this conversation. So I think we wanted to know what direction you have on what type of owner can apply for a land bank garden.
I'll take a stab at it. So my thinking is, if you are wanting to do this commercially, then you will have to show that you are a legit commercial entity, right? So either give me an LLC or any of those other, I'm blanking on all the other legal entities that you could be. And the big one would be, can we tax, right, whatever you are selling, right? That would be the big one for me. As far as, I guess it gets, if you're not wanting to do it commercially, and maybe that's another conversation. If we're talking non-commercial, but you do not live next to that particular parcel, should you still be eligible to ask for that particular land? That's where I am stumped. I don't know. Any thoughts, anyone?
I guess my thought would be this conversation somewhat relates to another topic that we need to get to, which is, what does this locational criteria look like? which may be a zoning question, not a land bank question. So I guess we could think about it is if it's a victory garden, let's say we create a classification of types. So we, maybe it's based on size or maybe it's based on ownership or whatever it is, right? But if it's a victory garden, I think it's one thing to have that victory garden as a nonprofit or a private business or nonprofit or private citizen on your block. It's very different to go to some other block in some other neighborhood and just say, I want that lot to build my victory garden. And you're looking around and you're going, well, there's like 1,000 lots on your block. What's wrong with that block, right? So I think that has a locational element to it that we might want to think of. Whereas a community garden maybe is a little more generous because it's a collection of, it's a nonprofit. Sometimes a lot of these community gardens are sponsored by municipalities to do them. They find that type of property. Like maybe there's a world where those types of gardens are a little more generous on where they're allowed because they are communal in nature, as opposed to my private piece of property next to your house. Again, if you remember the picture that Judge showed right before we entered these slide sections, there's something about that I think I'm not sure there is direction to give other than yes, look into that and we kind of come up with something, right? And then the third one being a business that's going to have a certain acreage requirement. And I think that's going to have its own future zoning buffers and setbacks and other things that I think will probably address most of that. But again, I guess from our standpoint, maybe my standpoint, I don't want to speak for our other staff here. I really don't see why we would hold people to partnering with a nonprofit if one, they're their own master gardener. Let's say they are. Maybe we have some criteria. Well, have you ever started a garden before? Are you a master gardener? Like, is there a certification that allows us that we need to see before somebody just walks up and says, I want to build a garden?
I know we had our land bank listening sessions and we did a lot of work prior to the pandemic on the Northeast Area Master Plan. And I referenced that because so many of the lots are in that area. Is there a place for this specific question in the planning that's coming? The community pizza and planning opportunities, does this fit in there or no? Or should we just go revisit what the Northeast Master Plan says best we can to this question? Does that make sense?
I think the comp plan is going to hear a lot of input, again, based on, if I were to assume the previous input rolls into the comp plan as input for urban gardens, I think comp plan will establish policy that says, we're supportive of urban farming and urban gardening, exploring that, right? That will direct us to look at the zoning code and make changes.
Okay.
It'll probably also ask us to, for instance, partner with BPU and get the same deal for gardens that we have for buildings, right? Like no one's going to get a garden if they have to pay $5,000 to get a water hookup.
Right.
It's not going to happen. I don't care who you are. It's just not going to happen. So I think, and again, that's not a policy conversation. That's a land bank board of trustees conversation with the BPU board.
Okay.
And so, that's more about strategy. And so I think that I expect the garden people to show up in comp planning and say, yes, we want to figure out a way to have policies that are generally much more supportive of the different diversity of urban gardening, closing food deserts, food distribution, vertical integration. These guys can go on for days about the types of policies they want to make sure we're thinking about and directing towards. And some, probably not all of those will end up there, right? But for this conversation, I do think there's a level of, let's let the zoning do the zoning and we need to go figure that out. But if we agree that gardens are good, we should use land bank for gardens. There's many different types of gardens. I have a hard time understanding why we would then say, but only nonprofits can have those gardens.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I don't necessarily believe that we should restrict it to nonprofits. I think nonprofits, neighborhood groups, individuals that live on that same block. What we might want to consider, and I know this is kind of getting further along, but this is pretty neighborhood character defining activity, right? Is whether or not we should include some sort of neighborhood letter of support for those organizations or individuals that are not located in the very parcel that they are seeking to acquire. That gets us away from, Joe who lives out in my district in Midtown, but who wants to go and start 10 gardens, in Quindaro. Like, it just doesn't make sense, Joe. You don't live there. So,
and is that different than no stated opposition, active support for something?
I'll let you all research that. and here's the other thing. See what other I don't know if, like, for the city of Detroit or if other jurisdictions have like a garden form where you can apply and they have all of these qualifications of, did you get most of the neighbors to support? Did you have whatever? But this is neighborhood character defining activity that is not necessarily building a home. We would snuff some of this out on the neighborhood and community development standing committee. But I do think we should be mindful of it. If you live next to a whole bunch of gardens, that does impact quality of life.
Absolutely.
And yes, and I can hear some commissioners telling me that in my ear. Being mindful of 5 minutes left.
I got one last question to ask.
Okay, go for it.
So what is left here is currently land bank policy does not allow any of those gardens to have animals on that, including the as of right zoning standard to have less than 6 fowl on a piece of property. Can't have that either. So land bank says no livestock whatsoever. So you can't even have chickens, which you could have if it was a single family parcel or any otherwise owned that property. So the policy is in conflict with zoning currently on this issue. I'm just going to go ahead and say my recommendation is we should throw that out completely and just let zoning be it is. Just like we say, if you want to do something, you have to go get that building permit and that land entitled. If you have a urban farm that's less than 5 acres, more than 3, and you want to have livestock, you got to get an SUP and you got to have a conservation district plan to make sure you're not letting manure run into waterways and all that stuff, right? And I think we just, in this policy, simply say, remove that section potentially, and then say, you have to follow all other zoning standards. And again, I think that is a bit of a catch-all, but I think that catch-all also puts the impetus on planning and urban design to then update the zoning code to do all these things. Which again, I think I'll be the first one to say isn't going to line up perfectly. There might be the policy allows it, but the zoning doesn't yet. There's going to be a period where that's going to happen. I think that's okay. We just maybe want to have a conversation during the comp plan process, to your point, Commissioner, about where are the priorities? Do you want me to, like I'm working on short-term rental right now, for instance, right? Do you want me to not continue down the path of all these other ordinance amendments I was working towards before we get to zoning code update because we need them now? Or should I shift away from housing and do this one? I think those are the types of policy, strategy, prioritization conversations we can have through comp plan with the new CAO, stuff like that. But that's the kind of direction we need. Otherwise, I'm going to start working on accessory structures after short-term rentals.
I'll make this easy, and I think we can all be in agreement. Follow the regular zoning requirements and let that determine it. Let's not put the weight of determining that on the land bank policy. I think that just gets us beyond the scope of what we're doing. Okay, we are 2 minutes to spare, which is great. Do you have other? Yeah. Oh, your mic.
Sorry. So Jeff Fisher's here and I appreciate that. And I just wonder, based on what you've heard so far, is there something that we're talking about that concerns you in your line of business or things that you think maybe we need to be alerted to? Just curious.
Well, thank you. I was actually taking notes that I was going to share later. So I was wondering what the desired outcome. I missed the last meeting and I'm not sure I was in early on any discussion about desired outcomes. And so it seems like what I've heard is support wealth building in the community, reduce burden on the government, and even increase tax revenues, and then improve the aesthetics of the community, right? Seem to be the three big things. And so I kind of wonder, how do we make sure we achieve those things? And when it comes to the wealth thing, and I'm thinking, why are we charging any fees? Let's make entry into this program as easy as possible, but balanced with high accountability somehow. And I heard a few ideas, like I think it was the third option that Wendy brought up, the option. So maybe there's some agreed to metrics or criteria, maybe not through a lease, because that does sound burdensome. But that both parties agree on, we're going to do these things with this property. And then there's monitoring along the way, just like we do with any other property through codes enforcement kind of approach, right? If they don't meet it, maybe the UG has to take it back. That's kind of what I'm thinking. Make it easy for people to get into it. Remove restraints. And then high accountability. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher. With that, we are at 5 o'clock. Well, actually, it's 4:54 on my watch. It says 4:54, but my UG laptop is always 6 minutes ahead, which is great because it keeps me on time sometimes. No, thank you for that, Mr. Fisher. And I do think as we think about these policies and once we have a finished product, there will be more in-depth analysis from some of the other departments, right? BPU, right? From Public Works as well. And of course, from community members who are itching to get before us. So yeah, other questions or comments? Yeah.
Gunnar Hand, Director of Planning and Design. If I may, I would just kind of lay out kind of next steps, if that's okay. So we're going to go back and look at commercial yard extension research and come back to the committee about this. Next month, we were planning on doing neighborhood context / design and process. I think we can finish both like we did today in May. And I would put forward this to you all. The budget cycle is approaching. The comp plan process is trying to do some things in May that that I think establishes some North Stars for both comp plan and budget process. But because budget is late and because budget is going to be condensed, I would recommend that we try to finish in May so that we all of us, comp plan commissioners, Jeff, CMIP, everybody focuses in on the budget process this summer. And then we spend that time while we're all pushing the community towards, as well as engaging in the budget process, to draft the ordinance and come back in the whatever, late summer, fall, whatever you guys want it to be. And then that's where we pick up the conversation after budget. There's a lot going on in the 2 months during the budget process. And I just feel like staff is not going to be able to be prepared at the level that we like to have these meetings, which I think have moved pretty effectively and efficiently because we've done a lot of back work before these meetings. We're not just showing up here. So I know that we wanted to have maybe June, July, but I would like you all to think about maybe pushing it down, coming back after budget, and then we can have that whole process of approval and other engagements and other stuff like that thereafter.
Yeah, Commissioner Bynum.
A housekeeping issue. Any chance on May 25 that we could start at 3? Because we have a 5 o'clock special session in this room that night. And that's my pilot committee. And so I'm going to be prepping community members to sit at that table and help be a part of a presentation. We're going to practice several days ahead of time, but I'm just wondering about logistics and
we can
traffic. And if we could bump to 3, then
I think it works for staff if it works for you all.
Yeah, I will work with Lisa and Deanna, and we'll
okay.
And worst comes to worst, Commissioner, we can end early.
Yep.
Okay.
So,
All right.
I mean, quite frankly, I don't know what all the conversation will entail. I doubt it's going to be as extensive as some of these other topics have been, but we'll make it work. Commissioner Ramirez.
I will be coming late
Okay, gotcha.
because I do not get off work till 3.
Gotcha.
So
Okay.
I'll be a half hour late.
Okay, no, and that's, yeah, we'll make it work regardless. Yeah, we may just end early.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll just end early 30 minutes before to give some time. Okay. As far as moving it to just kind of letting the budget kind of take its course. I'm good with picking up if y'all want to do it in August, September. Does that sound like a reasonable?
I think that would give us more enough time to develop a draft over the course of the summer. I mean, there's a part of me that's just a little worried that with that gap, there's kind of loss of momentum and focus. But I think everything that we're looking at at least from the planning and urban design department, it's going to be crazy time during budget, and we're going to shut down all of our comp plan stuff we're not going to shut it down. That's going to be the moment where we pivot and go to where people are as opposed to call people to us, because we're going to be do so much calling people to us during the budget process. We're going to encourage everyone who's engaging in comp plan to go engage in budget. Again, with that North Star I don't know if you guys I think I've been putting it in Friday notes, but we have that Vision Summit in mid-May that we're going to do. And so I think that's a really good precursor to budget, because it's going to talk globally about setting North Stars. And then you go dig into the budget for a couple months, and then you come out of that and we kind of reassess what our vision for our community is now that we've just experienced this budget process, having learned a little bit ahead of time. So,
Okay. How about this? We can work offline, but let's look at some dates for July, August, see what makes the most sense and just get something on our schedules. I don't want to just cancel everything.
Yep.
But definitely for June, July, we can get rid of those meetings and then play it by ear for August and then go from there. Okay, cool. I'll work with staff. Thank everyone, viewers, everyone. Thank you so much, staff. Thank you so much. This was super, super productive, and you all have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.